I've talked quite a bit on this channel about a period of Irish and Northern Irish history known as the Troubles, or na Triploidí. In this period from around 1969 to 1998, what started as a Catholic civil rights movement soon resulted in conflict between the Catholic and Protestant populations of Northern Ireland, both of whom had their own paramilitary groups, which then resulted in the British Army being sent in nominally to keep the peace. Now, I mentioned the role of the Republic of Ireland in the Troubles before in a previous video, and in a similar vein, I'd like to look at how the Troubles affected or did not affect Scotland, which at that time was part of the United Kingdom. Actually, I say that as if they had voted for independence. No, Scotland is still part of the United Kingdom and also was a part of the United Kingdom, but I'm going to particularly look at Scotland in this video because Scotland has a long history with the rest of Ireland. The relationship between the two goes back to long before Ireland was split into the northern 6 counties becoming Northern Ireland, a part of the United Kingdom, and the remaining counties becoming the Irish Free State and then the Irish Republic. In fact, the reason why Scots Gaelic as a language in Scotland appeared was because of several of these kingdoms that spanned across both Northern Ireland and the Highlands and Islands of Scotland. Now, it's in the north of Ireland that some of the strongest resistance was felt to English attempts at colonisation, particularly around the 15th and 16th centuries. It's for this reason that in the early 17th century, British monarchs decided to implement a policy that later became known as the Ulster Plantation, because this region of Northern Ireland was known as Ulster. With this plan, several of these northern counties were settled with a Protestant population, particularly those coming from Scotland, while there were some coming from England as well. Now, Scotland in the early 17th century was extremely Protestant, even more so than England, with many of those Protestants also being Presbyterians. These Protestant Scotsmen were then settled in the northern part of Ireland, displacing the Irish Catholics who had lived there before, and they set up their own towns and institutions. This would lead to a backlash, however, and around the time of the War of Three Kingdoms, previously known as the English Civil War, an Irish Confederate army would take over much of Ireland. It's too simple to say that this was Catholic versus Protestant, as many Irish Protestants also supported the Confederates. But what is clear to say is that the newcomers from Scotland and England were banding together to fight against those Irish Confederates, and in the end, they were actually helped by an army coming over from Scotland. Given that this army arrived around 30 years later, many of those Scottish Covenanters, as they were called, were probably the kin of these new settlers in particularly the north of Ireland. And so this relationship between those who had come and settled in Northern Ireland and those in Scotland remained particularly strong and remains so to this day, particularly in folk songs and in folk culture. In fact, the language that is spoken throughout much of Northern Ireland and indeed part of the Northern Republic of Ireland is called Ulster Scots and is seen as being a variant of the Scots language which emerged in Scotland and was then brought over by these new immigrants into Ireland from Scotland. Now, the movement also went the other way, particularly in the second half of the 19th century, following the disastrous Irish potato famine and the worsening economic and political situation in Ireland. Many people left Ireland's shores. Indeed, a culmination of the potato famine, excess deaths, and for a large part migration out of Ireland meant that the population dropped from around 8 million to around 6 million. Now, a large number of these immigrants would go to the New World, to America and Canada, and to other places around the British Empire. However, many would also go across the Irish Sea to Britain, to its big industrializing cities such as London, Birmingham, Liverpool, Manchester and Newcastle. However, in Scotland, the main destination was Glasgow, and this can still be seen if you look at a demographic map of Catholics in Scotland. Apart from the traditional heartlands of Catholicism in parts of the Islands and Highlands of Scotland, you can also see that Glasgow is where a very large proportion of Scotland's Catholics live to this day. And this is largely a result of Irish immigration in the 19th and 20th centuries. This would go on to lead to sectarian divides within the city of Glasgow, as newcoming Irish migrants would clash with the Scottish Protestant and often Presbyterian population that already lived there. And the consequences of this can still be seen today, as Glasgow is the city outside of Ireland with one of the largest Orange orders, a strictly Protestant unionist order that hold orange marches in the city to this day. Indeed, the way that most people learn that sectarianism of this kind exists outside of Northern Ireland, certainly the way I learned about it, was through football, as Glasgow's two largest football teams, Celtic and Rangers, have very much embodied this divide between Irish Catholic immigrants, or those of that heritage, and Scottish Protestant unionists in terms of the two football teams of Celtic and Rangers. In fact, traditionally, this divide can also be seen in the two largest football teams from Edinburgh, Hibernian and Hearts. Indeed, if you look at Hibernian's crest, there's a lot of very Irish things on there, but I think today this one is far less sectarian, certainly in character and what I've seen and heard, than the old firm rivalry in Glasgow. So given this divide where we have a Catholic minority, we have people coming over from Ireland into Scotland, and this sectarianism that was growing in Scotland in the 19th century, why then didn't we see a similar kind of troubles emerge in Scotland as we did in Ireland? Well, there are a few reasons for that. One is that, unlike in Ireland, Scotland was never partitioned. In 1921, the northern 6 counties became part of the United Kingdom because there was an, albeit small, but there was a majority of Protestants in these counties. Notwithstanding, they were only ever a small majority, and there was a significant minority of Catholics in Northern Ireland as well. This situation was really rather different in Scotland, where outside of Glasgow, there really wasn't a large Catholic population at all. And even inside Glasgow, they were a smaller minority than was the case in Northern Ireland as a whole. Furthermore, what's more important is that this divide wasn't as politicised as it was in Northern Ireland. There were Catholics and there were Protestants in Scotland, but that wasn't the major focus for political division. In fact, Scotland, throughout the time of the Troubles, so the end of the 1960s, was far more aligned with politics as it was in England and in Wales, with a split between Labour and Conservative. Scotland did have their own nationalist party, the Scottish National Party, which had started to make some minor gains by the 1960s, but that was still very much a minority group in government, and they certainly weren't calling for the same style of revolution or separatism as were some groups in Northern Ireland. Indeed, in 1979, there was a referendum on devolution in Scotland, so whether more power should be brought to Scotland instead of being centralised in Westminster in England. A referendum was held, and 52% of those who voted in favour of this happening. However, this is very different from actual outright independence, and a similar polling from 1979 found that only around 8% of Scottish people believed that Scotland should be an independent country, showing that this was really a minority position at that time. That's a very different situation to Northern Ireland, where practically all the political parties, or the mainstream political parties, fell on one side of the divide or the other. And the politics was far more connected with religion, which is something that certainly wasn't the case in Scotland. Indeed, throughout much the rest of Britain in the 1960s and 70s, it was more a case of class solidarity among working class people, rather than focusing on the divisions between them as was being done in Northern Ireland. Now, Scotland did also have an interesting history of fighting wars against the English and having fought against English attempts at conquest. However, the situation is really rather different to Ireland in its later history, which I think is crucial. For instance, Ireland was actively colonised by the English, with certain areas like the Ulster Plantation really being replaced, the population that lived there before, with newcomers from English and Scotland in an attempt to pacify the population. The same cannot be said for Scotland, and while there were similar things going on in the Highland clearances, the goal wasn't to set up a new population that was more loyal to the crown, but rather to set up sheep farming en masse. What's also different is the fact that it was a Scottish king, who was the 6th James of Scotland and the 1st James of England, who would become the monarch of England and actually set up the Ulster plantations in earnest. For the same part, throughout all of the 17th century then, or most of the 17th century, Scotland and England retained a separate parliamentary system, one which would only be united in 1707 with the Act of Union. And even then it wasn't imposed on Scotland as such. The Scottish Parliament had to actually vote into power the fact that the two nations would be joined into a union, the forerunner of the United Kingdom. This meant that the political backdrop to Scotland during the same period that the Troubles flared was very different. And as already mentioned, the number of Protestants in Scotland, which you can see here from the 2001 census, is quite a bit larger than the number of Catholics. In Ireland, or in Northern Ireland rather, this also being from the 2001 census, these numbers are far closer together. It should be noted, however, that during the time of the Troubles, Protestants did make up a slightly larger majority, and that the Catholic population has increased since that time, but it's good to show a rough picture of the demographic difference between Scotland and Ireland. So that's the reason why there wasn't sort of a Scottish-born Troubles, but that isn't to say that the Troubles didn't affect Scotland, because they most certainly did. For one, there was a large opportunity for both Loyalist and Republican paramilitaries to raise funds in Scotland from sympathetic audiences. Another was that Scotland was a great place for safe houses outside of Northern Ireland where there was less policing and army presence. At the same time, guns could be smuggled across to Northern Ireland. Guns in particular, smuggled, that was a great bit of Dunglish there. Mixing English smuggle and Dutch smuckle. But anyway, guns could be smuggled across to Northern Ireland over many of the ferry routes that went between the two countries that were less keenly policed. Of course, Scots would also be actively involved in the Troubles as part of the British Army, as a lot of the soldiers that went over to Northern Ireland were Scottish. Some 40,000 Scottish soldiers would serve in Northern Ireland during the entire Troubles, and of those, around 63 would end up losing their lives. Some of those who lost their lives, some of the first who were to be killed in Northern Ireland, were also the most famous. Happening in 1971, just after the start of the Troubles, 3 British soldiers who were off duty and drinking in a pub were lured away by members of the Provisional Irish Republican Army and then were killed. This was hugely controversial at the time because they had been off-duty soldiers and because one of those who had been killed had only been 17 years old. Several months later, the British Army announced that it would no longer be sending 17-year-olds into Northern Ireland or active combat zones. In the same year, there was something of a response from Scotland, in the form that the UVF, or the Ulster Volunteer Force, a loyalist paramilitary, detonated a bomb using explosives that had been sent from Scotland. Indeed, the UVF does seem to have had a presence in Scotland, most likely just in Glasgow during these years, as in 1979, the UVF would claim responsibility for blowing up 2 pubs in Glasgow. These pubs, they claimed, were collecting money to aid the Irish Republican Army. Thankfully, no one was killed during these pub bombings, and the expected IRA response or flare-up of sectarian violence in Glasgow never actually came. The man who was found responsible for this was William Big Bill Campbell, who was promptly arrested. The subsequent investigation rolled up the rest of this nascent UVF branch in Glasgow, and it seems that after this incident, there was no real UVF presence left in Scotland, and there were no further bomb attacks in Glasgow either. However, it was estimated in 1992 by police that collections for Ulster groups such as the Ulster Defence Association and the UVF, those supporting paramilitaries in Glasgow, was around £100,000 a year. The IRA did also attack Scotland once, but in a slightly different context. In 1981, when the Queen was visiting an oil refinery in the Northern Isles in Shetland, they detonated a small bomb. However, the Queen was still hours away and no one was killed or injured. Now, in 1995, the nephew of William Big Bill Campbell, a man called Jason Campbell, would go out and murder a 16-year-old Celtic fan. This sort of shows how the Troubles most affected Scotland and still do to this day. There was some signs that violence may have spiraled out of control in 1979 with the bombings, but there was no IRA response and things seemed to remain quiet. The main way in which the Troubles affected Scotland was to increase the tension around football matches, particularly around the Old Firm game, and that is where most people come into conflict with the fact that sectarianism still is a problem in Scotland. In recent years, football associations and the police have cracked down on the display of sectarian symbols inside the stadiums of both Celtic and Rangers, as well as the singing of certain songs and other defamatory comments that can be made about various aspects of the Troubles and those involved. Alright everyone, thank you very much for watching this video about Scotland during the Troubles. I thought it was quite an interesting topic to look at, as I know that it's interesting which sides had sympathy where during this period, and that has a lot to do with history. Of course, I talked about the Irish in the American Civil War and how large the Irish diaspora was in America and how they received support from there, and how also some of the Ulster, the loyalist groups in Northern Ireland also received support from their descendants and relatives over in America and in Canada. I think particularly a lot of Ulster Scots went to the Appalachians and sort of had an impact on the music and the accent there. So I thought I'd make this video about Scotland just across the water and how it had quite an interesting role, I think, in the Troubles. Anyway, let me know in the comments below if you enjoyed this video, if you'd like us to make any more comments or any more videos. Then yeah, I'd like to hear it. Anyway, thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next